My guest tonight is Joachim Hagopian. He is a West Point graduate and a former U.S. Army officer. He has written Don't Let the Bastards Get You Down, a manuscript based on his unique military experience. After leaving the military, Joachim earned a master's degree in clinical psychology and worked as a licensed therapist in the mental health field for more than 25 years. He now focuses on his writing, which is primarily concerned with U.S. international relations, national security issues, and I guess you could say the various intrigues of the deep state, New World Order, as such. His blog site is Empire Exposed Blogspot. Joachim is also a regular contributor to Global Research. Joachim, how's that intro?
Sounds good to me.
Covered all the important parts. Okay, great. And
Sure.
you wrote a couple of articles that really caught my eye here, and they kind of cover. It's kind of a survey of the political, geopolitical, cultural landscape today. One was, will the U.S. created ISIS attack Americans on U.S. soil? And homegrown terrorist, new draconian laws usher in the New World Order. The two articles kind of complement each other. Let's talk about ISIS first. I think that was the primary topic of your first article, ISIS, and what exactly ISIS is, the evidence that the terrorist group is actually a proxy force for Western intelligence.
Okay, well, I think we need to go back with a little history to start off. Um, and it was in the late 70s, early 80s that basically Reagan and Bush Sr., who was CIA director and then, of course, the vice president under Reagan, uh, during the Soviet Union, when they still had an empire, they went to the graveyard of empires, Afghanistan, and spent their Vietnam of 10 years losing the battle in Afghanistan, just like America recently has done. And we, of course, in the whole Cold War realm, were backing anybody who professed to be anti-communist. And so we felt like the United States government, not we, the United States government decided that they needed to support Afghanistan in their fight against the Soviet Union. So they got together with Mujahideen, and these guys are the pre-Al Qaeda jihadists, basically, and that's where Osama first basically got his experience in combat, leading the Mujahideen. He was a very young leader at the time, and so we backed them against the Soviet Union, and of course the Soviet Union lost. So it was basically a win for America and the West to have supported Mujahideen, and a lot of these guys were not even from Afghanistan. They were from mostly Saudi Arabia, which of course is where Osama bin Laden came from too. So we had our start with basically backing quote terrorists way back in the early 80s against the Soviet Union, and we're successful there. And so we figured, hey, this is a good proxy outfit that we can like continue to finance and arm and train. And let's go to Yugoslavia. Let's do our little number there and break up Yugoslavia. That's what America does. We go everywhere around the world to destabilize, break up, to make little weak countries from bigger, strong ones that basically don't buckle under to U.S. empire. So the target next in the 90s, under the Clinton conspiracy era, was the Yugoslavia, and in particular the Serbs there, because we were backing the Croatians, and so that little war happened throughout the 90s, basically, where the UN, the U.S. government, and the UN under the NATO command of West Point grad Wesley Clark, did a bombing thing, a little, basically a war crime right there. And we killed a bunch of civilians, and we wiped out the radio tower, the consulate of China. we did some bad stuff there in Yugoslavia, and we employed, of course, our at that time seasoned veterans of mercenaries, the Al Qaeda group, and of course they helped us move our Afghanistan drug, opium, and heroin along into the West in America, and so it was like a win-win for the U.S. government and Al Qaeda and Osama, and we were getting along real fine, so well that when the neocons came to power under Bush two and Cheney, they decided, hey, let's have a Pearl Harbor like event, and then we can do a war on terror. So who do we use? Of course, we use the Al Qaeda proxy mercenaries. So we hired a handful, I mean, supposedly 19 of them. I think 15 were from Saudi Arabia. And with Osama, it was all basically a deal set up with between Saudi Arabia intelligence, Israeli intelligence, and you know the British MI5, America, CIA, and the neocons in control and power did 911 with the help of Osama and some of the so-called Al Qaeda terrorists that we created, and so that one was done, and then of course we have this forever war on terror. It was all manufactured by the neocons who are in power in our U.S. government to this day, and so of course the evolution of it is. Oh, by the way, then we got bogged down. Of course, it was the justification to, under the lies of weapons of mass destruction that never existed under Saddam. We went into Iraq and destroyed that nation. And of course, before that, we were attacking the Taliban to remove them from power in Afghanistan. And and then of course, there's so much overwhelming evidence of 911 being an inside job, false flag. Uh, but I won't get into that. If you like, we can get into that a little bit more. But we have a lot of ground to cover here. So anyway, so basically, Al Qaeda was basically being used in Syria. We used them again. We also discovered that a whole bunch of those so-called terrorists that sacrificed themselves in 911 were actually alive and well in various places in the world. But anyway, we decided that Al Qaeda was kind of like basically the jig was up. People were catching on that we were using Al Qaeda as our proxy ally in Syria. We used them once NATO did their number on Libya and got rid of another former ally who was going against the U.S. dollar and Muammar Gaddafi. Once they go against the U.S. dollar as international standard currency, they're dead ducks, and that's what happened to Saddam, and that's what happened to Muammar. So anyway, but after the more war crime bombing by NATO, i.e., America, Libya, then we brought in Al Qaeda again there to wreak some more havoc, and it's basically been a totally dead, chaotic, violent nation ever since. And it was really before we did our number to destroy Libya, they were the blossoming flower of Africa, and that's why they were destroyed because they were unifying Africa. Muammar was so. Anyway, so we've used Al Qaeda over and over and over again, and eventually it started wearing out because I think the public was starting to catch on that, hey, you can't have it both ways. They're supposedly the terrorist that's lurking behind every corner to kill every American. And so how can you have them as our ally in places like Libya and Syria and a whole bunch of other places around the world? And so about that time, basically the Pentagon, and this has been confirmed by reports that go back to 2011 and 2012, the Pentagon and the National intelligence information have documents that were with the Freedom of Information Act uncovered. Basically, where back in 2011, 2012, the United States made a decision to basically arm in major weapons with what the group that ended up becoming ISIS, the Islamic State, the big monster on steroids. Okay, we created another monster, and they're the ones, of course, that are doing the beheading of the week, and they showcases it on YouTube. It's like a total propaganda site. You know, yes, they're bad people, and yes, they do kill people. That part I think is real, but they're a manufactured enemy that is constantly supported. Their supply line in Iraq and Syria is supplied by us and NATO and England. There have been ample evidence that food supplies, medical supplies, arms are being airdropped by the United States to make sure that they keep fighting against Assad in Syria and continue to wreak havoc. Basically, the plan for Iraq is to break it into three parts: the Sunni part, the Shiite part, and of course the Kurds to the north. So that's the agenda. We just basically invent a new enemy. And of course, back in 2014, came along the U.S. induced, State Department induced coup in Ukraine, where we got rid of another sovereign nation, democratically elected leader. He might have been corrupt, but pretty much every leader in every national government is corrupt, pretty much around the world. And there's no more corrupt ones than the ones we tend to support. So anyway, we went into Ukraine and have been wreaking havoc there. Everywhere we touch, it's the King Midas in reverse. Our agenda is basically, we don't actually lose wars because the globalists are actually in charge of our foreign policy. The Council on Foreign Relations, basically, they're the public face for the globalists that are really calling all the shots on this earth. And certainly the Council on Foreign Relations dictates U.S. foreign policy, along with Israel and Netanyahu, although they're losing a little favor because there's a little bit of a squabble going on now over Iran, with Obama and company wanting to move forward with the recent agreement on making sure that the Iran does not develop military nuclear capability, which the CIA, our own criminal CIA, has been saying that they never developed any, and it was backed by other inspectors that have gone in. But anyway, I'll let you ask the next question.
Yeah, that was a wonderful, I guess, summation or survey of, I guess, of the history of these intrigues and the current situation.
Yeah.
People do point to the obvious nature of these so-called terrorist outfits being some sort of proxy force, because you can trace their lineage back to the Mujahideen, which was a U.S. intelligence operation, which dates back to what, I guess, July '79 with Brzezinski and Operation Typhoon. It was, as you mentioned, a plan to deliver to the Soviet Union their own Vietnam. But there are other motivations involved here. One thing is the constant theme of narcotics trafficking in these various hotspots. You can see that in the Middle East, in Asia through the 30s, throughout the 60s and the 70s, in the Vietnam War, with heroin coming out of Asia and being shipped into Mexico, and of course that exposes the alliance between the U.S. government, intel community, and organized crime, and also corporate America, and then it gets into one big it's one big corporate monstrosity, really. That's
Black Ops has been financed primarily by our drug profits.
Sure, it's off the books operations, and numbers. I mean, the numbers in the hundreds of billions. So it's like almost they have a unlimited amount of resources to do these things. No accountability too, which is a bad combination given the realities of human nature. But also, you also mentioned or alluded to, when you point this evidence out, that there is a direct link between at least a symbiotic relationship between U.S. intelligence, the Pentagon, and these terrorist organizations. A lot of people will say, well, it's blowback. These people just don't know what they're doing. They're making a mess of the world. They're making money. But that really doesn't hold water because, if you look at the various conspiracy theories around 9/11, the most ludicrous of all the conspiracy theories is the official story, which is indeed a conspiracy theory. And if you do look at connect the dots and find out the dots were disconnected purposely, just like on Pearl Harbor, obviously was a setup. Now, the true nature of that setup is a subject of some controversy. Obviously, there's going to be some speculation and disagreement within the so-called truth community over the true nature and the full aspect of that. I think you're correct in saying that it was a kind of a coalescence of various interests, whether it's the Zionists, the bankers, big oil, the neocons, so it's kind of a hodgepodge of all these groups getting together to pull this thing off. So that's one. When you get into this, to go down the rabbit hole in this, that's when they got to realize that, in many respects, the truth of these things is denied to us, and we have to engage in some sort of informed speculation, and therein is the controversy. But people of good faith can disagree on these things without accusing each other of being agents of influence or whatever, which unfortunately you get that a lot when you get into this. But your cover of ISIS, it really, if you look at it, is ISIS. It's as you said, it's operating out of NATO territory, and like in Turkey. Sure. They can drive across the desert with this fleet of brand new Toyota trucks, and they're without being molested by NATO or U.S. bombs and all that. So it is pretty obvious. And of course, at the same time, where we're attacking under the pretext of attacking ISIS in Syria, we're bombing the hell out of the Assad regime, destroying their infrastructure. Sure. Which gets into this whole thing about destabilization of these countries that aren't exactly within the Anglo-American fold. Do you want to get into that? That the objective of this policy is destabilization and war?
Yeah. I mean, for centuries now, the elite have made lots and lots of money on war, as well as drugs in the last few centuries as well. And it's worked for them in the past, so why would they stop?
And also, that's also consistent with the Israeli policy, or the Oran Yinan plan, of kind of breaking up the area into these microstates that can be easily managed, and that's. But seen to what's unfolded in the past few years, which explains maybe why ISIS is enjoying support from Israel, which some people say ISIS stands for the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service. But you mentioned
it's an extension of them, I think.
Yeah, and you mentioned this character al-Baghdadi, and in your article you mentioned that he possibly is an actual Mossad agent.
Yeah. Supposedly born and bred in Israel. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting because I've read, this very, when you get into some of these intelligence operations, it really is a hall of mirrors. You can get really turned around and confused. That's the whole idea of it, I guess. But I think other whistleblowers, or supposed whistleblowers, like Victor Ostrovsky, he wrote By Way of Deception. And he claimed in that book that Carlos Jackal was always an Israeli asset. And if you really look at it, that makes a lot of sense, because one beneficiary of Carlos Jackal was the Israeli state, because you have this guy running around creating mayhem. That's the strategy of tension at work there, right?
Yeah. Long history of that. Gladio goes back to like the late 40s, early 50s with the Cold War in Europe, and of course more modern end of Gladio B ended up in Turkey mostly. But yeah, the whole idea of blaming an enemy on a false flag, something that actually our own governments, with England and America, there's inside intelligence operatives that are doing all this damage, blaming the designated enemy, and wars have been fought constantly with this as the MO driving force behind creating the tension, and it's all part of the Hegelian dialectic as well. You create a crisis so that you come up with a solution, and then you gain more absolute tyrannical control. And that's the pattern that's been repeated over and over again, along with a strategy of divide and conquer. They know how to, pit people against each other, pit groups against each other, religions, races, you name it, classes. the oligarchs know how to, stir the pie and make some trouble for everybody. Yeah.
And glad you mentioned the Gladio operation. Of course, as you mentioned, was a post-war um, false flag operation. I guess it grew out of the stay-behinds, which was developed during the war. The idea
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
to create these stay-behind armies during the war, and then after the war, I guess in anticipation of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe, they organized these outfits, which were, I guess, originally formed out of these residual fascist organizations that were left behind after the
Yes.
war. And of
Yeah.
course, these operations existed all throughout Europe, and Italy was called Gladio, so we just call it Gladio. But it is
Yeah.
documented, it is known that under Gladio, false flag operations were carried out in Italy and in Belgium. In Italy, they blew up train stations and killed, hundreds of innocent people,
Oh
killed and
yeah.
maimed
Yeah.
hundreds of innocent people. They assassinated a sitting Italian prime minister, Mori, because he was considering letting communists into the coalition government, and he claimed he
Mhm.
got a direct threat from Henry Kissinger, and he was kidnapped. And this is all, and this was blamed on like Red Brigades, the Red Army factions, and some claim that Baader Meinhof was part of Gladio. And in Belgium, I think you had these random mall shootings, which might tell us something about what's occurring in the United States today, because there is a precedent for this stuff. So when people go out and they speculate that some of these shootings occurring in the United States may be a psychological warfare operation, it was done in Europe in the 80s. So
Mhm.
there is precedent, and of course
Yeah.
Operation Northwoods, which I'm sure
Yeah.
which people are aware
Yeah.
of, and that of course what part of the plan of that was to fake terrorist operations in the United States and blame it on
Yeah.
Cuba to justify an invasion, and part of Operation Northwoods was proposed that he had to blow up a plane allegedly full of college students, get it shot down in the sky, and this was done with a drone aircraft. This involved fake victims and fake loved ones, mourning loved ones. So what does that
Gee,
tell?
where have we seen that before?
Well, why I mention this is when people get into the speculation regarding media fakery, whether it's Sandy Hook. This gives us some indication of what the deep state or these so-called security agencies are capable of contemplating and doing.
And
So
have been doing for the last 50 plus years.
yeah, if you look into that, yes. You also have media fakery, which this involves the complicity of the media. Well, we do know from the '70s that the mainstream media, the networks, the newspapers were a wholly owned subsidiary of the Central Intelligence Agency under Mockingbird, and you
Mockingbird, yeah.
and you had the CNN, which was caught faking missile attacks during the Gulf. I mean, staging fake missile attacks during the Gulf War. So
Yeah.
you probably seen that download from the satellite where they're faking a missile attack, and actually it's in the Atlanta studios.
Yeah. Yeah.
You see that, and how can you go back and watch CNN or CSNBC or CNNBC or Fox and believe anything they're reporting? You know,
Right.
you have to
Right.
be somewhat skeptical. Um, but again, what you're saying is that the feds and the terrorists, their relationship is more than symbiotic. It's actually operational, is what you're saying.
Sure. Yes.
Mhm.
Yep.
And in your article, you get into, of course, you get into the some of these incidents in the United States, whether it's the World Trade Center bombing in '93 or the Sandy Hook incident and these recent shootings. You want to tackle those issues? What you think was going on with those situations?
Sure. Well, let's see. Of course, the Boston Marathon bombing. There was another false flag. Uh, uh, but what the FBI engages in is basically they end up recruiting and the older Zarnov brother was an example of that where he was recruited by the FBI and the CIA. They actually did send him back to Chechnya and Dagestan and on trips and would come back. They actually there's a lot of money that's going out to recruit these young people basically almost like as gladio operators. Yeah, I mean, there's a long history with the government, and then they turn on them, just like they turn on Gaddafi and Hussein, and they use them and they use them up, and then they destroy them, and this is the history of what our government does. There's no loyalty at all. And so yeah, it was a total false flag with the Boston Marathon. I mean, we can get into a few of the details, the announcement that it was a drill, which it was, until they decided all of a sudden to make it pretend that it was real. And you know, I still am out as far as the jury on whether actually there were injuries. There might have been. I'm not certain about that, and I'm not certain about the alleged dead people either. But anyway, it was another false flag. An outfit called Kraft. There's photos of them with their logo on their jacket, on their clothing, and their hats, and they were actually the ones that set down the supposed lethal bomb. And they were operatives basically of our government. They're a private military security company. And then, of course, the whole thing that went down in Connecticut with the young kids. Supposedly there weren't no deaths involved in that one either. And then the more recent ones, like this year with the incident that happened in South Carolina. The payout to the alleged family victims of $29 million within like 3 days or something after the incident. There was no crime scene. They had service 3.5 days after the alleged incident occurred in the church. Um, there's just so many holes to every single one of these incidents. Basically, you can like almost say 100% with certainty that any major incident that's supposedly of violent nature in America now is a false flag. The incident in Garland, Texas, where these supposed ISIS members went to Garland to make some trouble for the people that were purposely propagandizing and stirring up trouble with the Islam buffoonery of a cartoon, in response to the whole Hebdo and other false flag in Paris. Yeah, every single major incident is all false flag. I mean, they keep getting away with it, and as long as they keep propagandizing over and over and over with the mainstream media, just telling all the lies, a dumbed down public who is seems incapable of critical thinking just kind of accepts it very gullibly as the narrative that they hand out is the one to believe. And yet there's overwhelming evidence in one of these incidents that it's another false flag by our government. So, I mean, it's just a long history. And of course, the agenda with the whole incident of the Confederate flag and this young guy that shot up these people in the church. That was a whole thing. All these incidents with Baltimore riots and of course, the incident in Ferguson last year where they're killing African American males. And then when the African American community protests, they have agitators that go in there and become violent. I mean, it was proven that George Soros financed them in Ferguson. Uh, it's all about the government wanting to create racial tensions and a race war. I believe that it is the agenda of the globalists that are behind the regime in the government that's creating all of this divide and conquer, bickering and fighting. It's not working all that well, but they're doing their best to make a race war. And of course, they've been preparing for war against the people now. That was all part of their long-term strategy going back to 911 was to I mean, you look at the eugenics plan, they've been talking about overpopulation for like 50 years now, and they have people on record, Bill Gates and Ted Turner. These guys are on record, saying we need to reduce the population down by 90%. They're talking about like anywhere from a half billion to maybe up to a billion people out of the 7.3 that are now breathing on this earth. They want basically about 6.5 billion of us. That's 13 out of 14 of us human beings living right in this moment on this planet. They want us dead. That is their agenda. That's why they have their soft and hard kill methods. Soft kill. Let's poison the foods. Let's get Monsanto to poison the earth. Let's alter all the seeds so that everything's messed up. Where these GMOs are all that they're eating because that's all that they're, serving in the conglomerate grocery store chains. It's all a very wicked conspiracy to kill people off the slow way. And of course, the slow way, that way, the very corrupt health industry, they're parasites off slow death, basically. That's the agenda. They want slow death for a lot of people. So they have the chemtrails, the heavy metal toxins that come down or rain down with all over the United States and Australia now and Europe. They're doing this, and they've been doing it for like 2 decades, 3 decades maybe, where they're in planes, and it's all, hush hush. But everybody, well, I won't say everybody, but there's a lot of people that are aware of what they're doing with and it's geoengineering, where they're messing with the climate. They have this whole conspiracy thing about CO2 causing the heating of the earth, which is just a bunch of crap. Uh, and that's an excuse that they're using for a one world government, and the Pope's coming to Washington uh, with a historic joint session of Congress for the first time in history. The Pope's going to deliver a speech. And then he goes the very next day to the UN, and he's going to be talking about one world government, basically. He's a stooge for the globalists, basically. So yeah, that's the whole agenda is to kill us off. I mean, they want a very small percentage of people on this earth to be their lackeys, and then the 0.0001% that own and control everything on this earth, they get to have their little lackeys, and they're also preparing for possible nuclear war and all of this kind of thing. They're preparing for it. They have all these underground bunkers in cities and underground railway and highways, and they've got supplies for several years under there. They've also done some space colonization that we don't know about with Black Ops. So there's all kinds of things. They have their agenda. I mean, I was thinking before I really looked into, how they're well prepared for whatever happens, whether it's nuclear power that destroys life on the surface of this planet, or just partial death. But they've got their contingency plans, and it involves being underground or possibly even out in space with colonization out there. It's a very, very diabolical agenda that they've had for. I mean, the globalists have been around for. They met in 1913 and came up with a Federal Reserve where a private, the central banking system based on debt and theft was allowed to happen for over 100 years now. They've been around. It's the Rockefellers, it's the Rothschilds, the Warburgs. These families have been around and in control, along with the royalty of England. I mean, they've been around for centuries, controlling all the shots, making wars. It's got to stop. And right now, we have a house of cards economy, particularly in the West, where it's going to blow. There's a perfect, they call it the perfect storm, where all of these horror events are going to converge, and they're projecting a lot of speculation around basically near the time that Jade Helm military exercise ends by September 15th. Right in that time period, maybe even a little bit later than the 15th of September, into October, they're projecting all of these horror stories of cataclysmic events that are going to happen that are going to end up causing war on American soil. Supposedly ISIS, they had a training camp with the drug cartel 8 miles from the border near El Paso, and that they've had free access with an open border into the United States for the last several years. And supposedly there's going to be some false flag attacks on U.S. soil, killing Americans coming up in the next month or two. I hope to God that it doesn't happen, but there's evidence that indicates that that's probably what will happen. They also have insiders that have worked in the Homeland Security saying that they've been preparing for you know, false flag attacks, a cyber attack on our banking infrastructure that's going to bring down banking where people can't go to the ATM anymore. And they also have legislated laws now where they're going to be able to confiscate or steal the people that have deposits of bank account money. The big banks are going to have a bail-in. They're already doing this in places like Greece. They did it in Cyprus a couple of years ago, where they actually have these bail-ins, and there's a contingency where instead of the bailout taxpayer-funded thing, it's going to be bail-in by the simply confiscating all the money that are in these bank accounts. So all kinds of horror stories are probably ahead for us. And it's a globalist agenda, basically Agenda 21, the UN Agenda 21 has been, which was signed in 1992. It's just a matter of time before they get their way of a one world government. That's what they're shooting for. They got the microchips that they're ready to put in. They're already doing mandatory. California passed a law. They're going to be doing mandatory vaccination for adults as well as children. And along with the vaccinations that are required by every human being on the earth, they're going to be doing microchip implants. And that way they really have total control over the population. So, yeah, all these horrible, tyrannical, New World Order, evil, yeah, it's here. It's here. There's lots of evidence coming out. And 2015, it's all accelerated. And my sense of it is they knew they have this band-aid economy where they keep just printing up more fiat money out of thin air, and they knew that they can't. That's not a strategy that will go with the long haul. So they know that the economy is a house of cards and it will be falling. And obviously, the U.S. dollar and the petrodollar are not going to be the standard currency. China and Russia have been hoarding gold, and they want the next currency to be backed by gold, and China is basically jockeying itself for its currency to become the standard. So there's a currency war going on. There's a lot of speculation over that huge chemical bombings in Shenzhen, China, last week. That it might have been payback for the devaluing of the yen, Chinese yen. So, yeah, a lot's happening. I mean, it's just incredible the amount of developments and events that are going down. And of course, the truth behind it, we will never know if you pay attention only to the government and mainstream media.
Yes.
That's why it's good to have shows like you, and then global research and all of this. The alternative news is the only salvation of to have any kind of truth, and they know this too. They've lost their audience with mainstream media, so they've got a lot of plants out there, a lot of moles out there stirring up false information and disinformation. Basically to muddy the waters so that the people don't know who to believe. There's a whole agenda there as well.
And there's some you could say some planted or false leaks too. I think some people have speculated that's the true nature of the Snowden affair, and also the WikiLeaks, where these people are, whether unwitting or witting, they're assets, and they're designed to go out there and create create some sort of predictive programming in the culture, or to make some false leaks to prepare for some of these events that you mentioned might occur in the next 12 to 24 months, is to prepare society for it. Again, when you get into these things, when you go through this sort of this list of horribles of what may occur, the average person who does imbibe mainstream media is going to go, "What the heck is this guy talking about? This sounds crazy." But you got to do your research, and if you just look between the surface of some of these events, you realize there's much evidence and much validity to these suspicions or fears. The simple question of crisis actors, and to pull off some of these false flag events, you need a lot of people to be involved in this and to participate in these events, to pull off the media event, the fake media fakery.
And apparently they don't have enough because they've been caught using the same ones
Yeah,
in some of these false flag events.
but with a Mockingbird media, you can get away with this because it's not like you're going to have the New York Times or Fox News or NBC News going to investigate this stuff. They're just going to read from the script. Good example, somebody have pointed out with as far as crisis actors goes, is this firm. It's called Vision Box, which does indeed employ crisis actors to go in into fake events. And the question of how are these people being used? But if you look at how DHS they dole out millions, hundreds of millions in grants throughout the country to carry out these events, and it's very easy to take an event like this and go live with it and fake it. And I think you and other observers have pointed out some of the odd way that some of the victims or loved ones of the victims have acted, whether it's, because there was Bobby Parker up in San Diego where he's yucking it up laughing just seconds before he starts talking about his, murdered daughter. You have, the happy amputee, double amputee showing up at a hockey game 3 weeks after losing both his legs, which some say, well, how dare you question it? How dare you question these victims? But the behavior is just odd and doesn't pass the Columbo test. I'm referring to Detective Columbo. Any detective will look at the demeanor of a victim or, to establish a path of investigation. And these behavior just odd.
You use that's just one piece to many that are just anomalies that are not explained by the official narrative.
The payouts is particularly telling, I think, when you have $30 million being dispensed. Well, that could be hush money if you're going to say how are they going to pull something like this off? Well, you dole out $30 million in a small community, you can get a lot of silence. And even down in Charleston, I mean, I can't read people's minds, but it just doesn't seem natural to me for children of a supposed slain mother to go out and be so calm and so dull in their response, and calling for peace and love right after their mother's been slain. It just isn't right. And I don't know, to me it doesn't prove it, but it is odd, and you see, and that's sort of a constant in all these things. Another thing is the notion that somehow if you have a loved one that is murdered, that then you should get a windfall. I mean, in the past, I always said that's why you had life insurance. That's why I have life insurance. That's why I pay a premium every 6 months for it. But where is it written that the federal government can come in and cut you a check because your wife, your spouse, or your parent's been murdered? But they do this now. It's sort of routine now in any high-profile event. But if I go out tomorrow, get killed in a car accident, the Justice Department isn't going to write my wife $1 million check. So that's just one area that is strange. You mentioned with the Boston Marathon, the Zarnev brothers, where he's apparently murdered in police custody, despite videotape of him being taken into custody alive. You have the murder of witnesses like Ibrahim Togashev, who was apparently shot to death by the FBI while questioning. And of course, there's no investigation. They just take the FBI's word for it. You have these killings going on, and you mentioned, of course, again, some of this stuff with the larger agenda regarding Rockefeller medicine and the gradual poisoning of society, whether it's through GMO foods or vaccinations. It's odd to me, it's just in a time when more and more is coming about the whole vaccination, I guess, paradigm is now being questioned. If you look into that, that's a problem in and of itself. But just now you have California mandating vaccinations. It's such an assault on personal liberty, and it's just being accepted, So, and again, that's again what we're talking about, I think, is sort of a shock doctrine. They impose these wars, revolutions, create fear in order to make sure that the people within society can't have a calm moment to think. Never a dull moment, so you can't really assess the situation. And of course, what does fear does? That's that strategy of tension. When you're constantly fearful, what do? You embrace the state.
That's what so much of this is motivated by a manipulation of emotion of fear in the population, so that they become more afraid and more compliant. When they are in that state, they're going to be very docile and easily controlled. And that's where they pretty much have a lot of Americans right now.
And what you've pointed out now, why I think it's a lot easier to accept that some of these black operations, intel operations, civil wars are being conjured up or being stirred up by U.S. operations. This is the game of nations. This is sort of the great game going on and strategizing and control the world's resources. And a lot of people can conceptualize that, but they have a hard time conceptualizing that the same destabilization efforts that are being brought to the poor souls of Ukraine or the Middle East or Asia or Africa or Latin America, for that matter, that the same people doing this might think that the same strategies can be applied to North America.
Sure.
You
And
know,
they are.
and so that's another thing is we're the conceit, or at least the comfort, think, well, they wouldn't do it to us. Well, they've been caught doing it to us, and they are doing it to us. Because it's all
Yeah.
part of the same thing.
Yeah.
About control.
Yeah.
Regarding Jade Helm, I read an interesting article about that written by Jay Dyer, Jay's Analysis, what exactly is Jade Helm? And if I can find in my notes here. Well, let me get this quote, psychological operations. There's a quote by Major General Ed Rouse. I guess he's involved in psychological warfare at the Pentagon. And his quote was, psychological operations, or PSYWAR, is simply learning everything about your target, enemy, their beliefs, likes, dislikes, strengths, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities. Once you know what motivates your target, you're ready to begin psychological operations. And that, so the Pentagon spends a lot of money studying this stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not like this is conspiracy theory. And of course, one of the chief psychological warriors in the Pentagon, was the Satanist. What's his name? Major Colonel Aquino. Are you familiar with him?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. He's a pedophile too.
Yeah. So, and because he's been implicated in the Franklin scandal, some of these organized
Yeah, yeah,
pedophilia, and out there in San Francisco, the Presidio scandal.
yeah, yeah,
Um, but Jay Dyer, in his article regarding Jade Helm, he says he thought the operation might not be as like an imminent police state measures to round people up, but it's to leak this stuff out to see what the reaction is. Sort of a game theory where the Pentagon has this algorithmic tracking of how we in the alternative media react to this, and
yeah. Well,
they're
there's a
watching
reason
social
why
media.
they came out with it publicly. What, 4 months before it started?
Yeah,
They wanted to actually measure the response that America would have to knowing that there's this grand, never before operation with one quadrant of America involved. They wanted to just sit back and record the reaction, and of course, with a whole, you know, movement in Texas. Oh, they're coming to, invade Texas and take us over and martial law. It may or may not happen. Martial law may happen in the next month or two, and it may not. It may just be a psyops. There's a strong possibility that it is just a psyops. I'm inclined that it is going to probably go live. I just think that there's so many things that are lining up with the timing there that I think it probably will go live with some kind of false flag incident. But but I mean, even if it is just okay, get used to it, folks. Military with automatic rifles and right in your doorstep in your neighborhood. Get used to it because it's here to stay. I mean, it may be that, and of course, there's also been a lot said about the software, the Jade Helm software that they're using now, where they're going with artificial intelligence, and they don't even need the human commanders making decisions on the ground anymore because they have all the data coming in live to then change as the circumstances on the ground change. Then the data, as far as what to do, changes too with artificial intelligence. I mean, it's pretty incredible the technology that they're using against us so that they have absolute control. And then, if there is in fact a civil war where there's patriots that are trying to fight back against this oppressive government, they have all this technology on their side with intelligence and artificial intelligence and the machinery and the weaponry to really wreak havoc. So yeah, it doesn't look good for the home team called us good old Americans.
Well, because by the good guys aren't, by their very nature, aren't organized because they're not psychopaths. They're just out there living their lives, trying to take care of their families.
Right.
And when you're fighting a determined foe, who's albeit a minority, but they're well organized and they have all the resources at their disposal. At the same time, they can claim the mantle of law, of authority. They're under the color of
Right.
law, national
And they've been
security.
planning this, and they've been planning this for years, literally years.
Well, that goes back to what the report from Iron Mountain, NSC, was it NSC 68 back in the late 40s, where constant warfare was necessary to maintain social cohesion.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
too was supposedly a hoax. Yeah, right. Okay, but you see it. We saw it played out in grim reality. So it's hard to. Yeah, it's a hoax. It was satire, but then you can point to events throughout those decades that prove that it was actual policy. Um, but that explains maybe even Sandy Hook, and maybe it's made Sandy Hook or some of the other shootings make them obviously false flags, so they can gauge alternative media as a response to this stuff. And it's all part of that
Yes.
algorithmic tracking. How do we
Yeah.
react to this? So the very fact we're having a conversation about it is we're playing into their game. But
Sure.
um, but you can't sit back and just let it happen, because I think if you do point out the obvious nature of some of these false flags, you could avert an actual event which could save lives. That's why it isn't futile. If you point
Right.
out the obvious nature of a bombing, maybe it makes it so they have to go out and fake killing, which in itself maybe is an improvement, because then you don't have real victims. And I
And
guess you could
and
say that.
there have been incidents, I believe, where people have exposed plans of false flags, and they had to stop them because it was already leaked out.
hmm so that's where we are. Again, we have to point these things out to people, but again, you got to do your research on these things. And I think for the majority of Americans who still uh, oblivious with by reading the mainstream media or entertaining themselves to death, this is hard to fathom. But you really,
Yeah.
once you get into it and you start understanding the strategy, the mindset, and the fact, indeed, the U.S. government has, particularly with their intelligence agencies and the military, have studied this stuff in depthly and spend a lot of time how to manipulate society. And this goes back. I mean, this is the whole idea of ruling through fear goes back to Plato and Machiavelli. So it isn't really a new thing. It's just the way that the psychopathic rulers control society.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's, again, it's hard to understand. It's hard to wrap your head around. Good example you've had recently. You wrote about what's going on south of the border, and of course, Mexico has always been a target of destabilization. Whether it's
Yeah.
narcotics trafficking, heroin from that south from Asia. But at the same time, if you destabilize Mexico and Latin America, you create an immigration crisis. And demographic warfare is also a strategy these people are seeing being played out in Europe with replacement immigration, and
Yeah.
that in itself is creating fissures and divisions within those societies. And you've had open statements about by various people, whether it's whether it's Sutherland, the Goldman Sachs guy, whether it's Wesley Clark saying that the notion of a racially cohesive nation state in Europe is now gone, is now part of history, and we need to integrate everywhere. And and that again doesn't it kind of create a situation where you're going to have constant civil strife and warfare?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's been the plan of the globalists to basically have the human migration from third world nations, usually darker skinned people from third world nations, basically immigrating into traditionally like Western Europe, the European Caucasian races that inhabit Western Europe, and I believe that it's all part of the plan to create racial, religious, and class conflict in every part of the world. And by doing that, the divide and conquer, you control the masses.
And at the
We've seen
same
it
time,
here. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, at the same time, you get a depopulation agenda going on here, because they've preached the gospel of birth control and abortion for 40, 50 years in the United States. They tried to do it earlier, but it was more or less stopped by the Catholic Church in the 30s. But in the 60s, the introduction of the pill, which was a Rockefeller invention, and also the spread of pornography and other cultural sleaze, they've demoralized the majority white population, leading to depopulation. At the same time, they've strategized or they've planned to this massive influx of third order populations into these areas. Do you believe there's a kind of a method to the madness there that's being carried out?
Oh yeah. In the same way that the globalist agenda is to destabilize the globalist slash U.S. slash NATO, Western agenda, destabilization. Well, the same applies to actually the human migration of different ethnicities and religions that they know will create conflict. And this whole thing on the war on terror, that's a war on Islam too. They've been using the Islam religion as a scapegoat too. So yeah, I mean, it's created so much ignorant hatred around the world that we have a handful of people, I believe, that have actually caused human evolution to regress. That's what I think.
But that's not part of the. I mean, I guess you could get into because this opens up a can of worms. Is this might get into transhumanism and this weird, Bruce Jenner thing and the transformation of man. These sort of this effort to, I guess this gets back into like cybernetics, and this goes back centuries. But I guess technology, they finally have now the technology, but they're trying to, I guess, at the same time make themselves gods, but at the same time they're degrading humanity. You
Yes.
know, so
Yeah.
it's this as you get into it's this multifaceted agenda where you have to, it's hard again. It's hard to believe that something so vast and so sinister can be being carried out. But as you get into it, as you look into these things, you start to connect the dots and see what's going on here. And you earlier in the discussion did a wonderful job of kind of wrapping it all together with whether it's Rockefeller medicine and vaccinations and poisoned food, and this makes everyone kind of weaker and sicker. At the same time, they can extract more wealth from us throughout life. They're setting us up for for a big fall, which
Yeah.
part of their agenda. I mean,
Yeah.
so we're getting near the end of the interview. So how would you sum up this? What is it, and what should we do about it?
Well, I think what the globalists are most afraid of is an informed public that is onto them, that they know the truth, they know this evil agenda that has been going down now for centuries, and I think their biggest threat, the globalists' biggest threat, is an informed and educated public that will then be making choices to actively oppose their agenda. And I do believe that we need to be localizing, we need to be decentralizing. Everything has been purposely designed for centralization. Well, we got to go the opposite route. You got to get together with your family and your neighbors and your community and grow your own food and take care of each other. That's where it's at. And we need to start regional and state power. I mean, right now there's enough states now that to call for a constitutional convention. Well, we need to start, reimposing our constitution that we have a bunch of traitors in power that have actually totally gone against the Constitution. So it's no longer our rule of law. We have a lot to do, and North Dakota has their own bank. There's bartering. There's a lot of local things that are going on. Worker ownership companies. I mean, they're just a whole bunch. Do a little bit of research and start connecting locally with other people, like-minded people that can think ahead and develop enough resources within your local community to be able to fight the globalist agenda that's out to kill us. Basically, that's it.
Well, that's a great way to close it out. Listen, I want to thank you for coming on the show to go over this stuff. We covered a lot of ground, and it's virtually impossible to really do a complete or a detailed, analysis of this event. But this is just kind of an introduction. But I do suggest if you doubt any of what we're saying tonight, just research it, piece by piece, spend a few months, a few years looking into the stuff, and you realize that this stuff isn't crazy. It's reality. Of course, the problem is the reality is crazy. It's not the people who are acknowledging reality. I want to thank you for coming again tonight. That's again, it's Joachim Hagopian. I'm sorry, Hagopian. And
Hagopian.
Hagopian, I'm sorry. And
Yeah.
his blog site is Empire Exposed Blogspot, and you can read his stuff at Global Research. He writes some pretty good stuff. It's worth reading. It's he gets into a lot, and again, it's
I'm also contributing now regularly to SOT.net, SOTT.net.
sot.net. Okay, what is that exactly?
That's a news website,
A news
and
website.
they, yeah, yeah.
Okay, listen, I want to thank you. Maybe in the near future have you on back again if you're willing to come back and discuss some other things.
Sure, sure. It's been a good hour, Tim.
Yeah, great. Listen, I want to thank you for giving me your time, and good night.
Good night.